The Vietnam War cost the lives of more than 58,000 American service members. They're memorialized on a wall that stretches nearly 500 feet from end to end. Now, imagine another 30 yards of wall, enough to accommodate another 10,000 names. That's the number of lives that were saved because thousands of Viet Cong ambushes, bunkers, secret tunnels, and booby traps were detected and avoided. And by detected, I mean, quite literally, sniffed out. August is National Dog Month in the United States, so in this episode, we salute the four-legged warriors who helped us fight the war in Vietnam, saving an estimated 10,000 American lives. From the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, founders of The Wall, this is Echoes of the Vietnam War. I'm your host, Michael Crone, bringing you stories of service, sacrifice, and healing from people who still feel the impact of that conflict nearly 50 years later. This is episode 11, Canines in Combat. The Vietnam War introduced American troops to a new kind of warfare. Patrolling thick, triple canopy jungles was dangerous by day and even more perilous by night. Enemy fighters used the jungle to their advantage, employing guerrilla tactics such as ambushes, mines, tunnels, and traps in ways that U.S. troops hadn't encountered before. A well-trained dog became an extension of his handler's senses, seeing, hearing, and smelling danger that was otherwise undetectable. These dogs were so effective that the enemy actually issued a bounty on them and their handlers. When you talk to these dog handlers about their experiences in Vietnam, they rarely talk about themselves. They talk about their dogs. Today, we'll hear from two of them. First, Callie Wright interviews Terry Kehoe about his German Shepherd dog, Prince. And then, after the break, we'll bring you my interview with John Dupla, who talks about the use of Labrador retrievers as trackers in the war.
I was a sergeant, infantry sergeant, scout dog handler, and I had a dog named Prince, who he and I were called out to different units in the field in Vietnam, and we would walk point for the infantry.
Terry, can you tell me, how did you become a dog handler?
It's a funny story. When I was in NCO school at Fort Benning, they were asking for volunteers for scout dog school. And I didn't know anything about scout dogs, except that I knew that scout dogs only went to the field for 10 to 12 days at a time. And I knew the infantry grunts were out there for 45 days. So I'm not a whiz at math, but I figured out it was better to be out there a shorter time. So when they interviewed me for that, being from Minnesota, I told them that I did a lot of things in Minnesota with sled dogs. I don't know a sled dog from another dog, but it works. And I became, I was sent to scout dog school at Fort Benning and then on to Vietnam.
What was scout dog school like at Fort Benning?
Scout dog school they tried the best they could to recreate Vietnam. That was after, the first part of the school was how to walk with a dog, how to work a dog on a leash, how to talk to a dog and all that. But the second part was the hands-on and working with the dog, crossing rivers, going through jungle type things, firing weapons, staying out in the field with the dog, all the things that we would do in Vietnam with the dog. So it was pretty realistic. The difference was that the dog I had at Fort Benning, whose name happened to be Prince, was a different dog than the dog I had in Vietnam.
And when you got to Vietnam, when did you meet your dog there, or had you already met?
No, when I first went to the 39th, and I'll say this, Infantry Platoon Scout Dog, IPSD, I walked in and, they said, welcome to our little compound, we were attached to the 173rd Airborne Brigade. We had our own little corner of LZ English, and I went up there and all I saw were these buildings covered with sandbags, and I could hear dogs barking. And they said, you're going to get Prince 672M. That was his number that was tattooed in his ear. And so I went back there, and all these dogs are barking, and here's Prince sitting there, not barking, looking up with these sad eyes and wagging his tail. They said, this is your dog. And I thought, geez, these others are so active, and he isn't. And somebody said to me, be happy. You're one of the lucky ones. You got one of the better dogs. So Prince had been there for 2 years already. He was a combat veteran. I was not. I'm just getting to Vietnam. I didn't know what I was doing or anything. So Prince, I've always said Prince was the smart one. I was there to carry his food and water.
How did you train with Prince?
The first couple of weeks, I just spent time with him all the time. I mean, whether it be sitting and just talking, with the guys, he was very friendly. He liked people. We did some training. We had some stairs and tubes and things like that set up in the back part of the compound that we would take the dogs to, and they would train doing that sort of thing. So agility type things. And, walking with them, sit, stay, crawl. And he and I learned together to do, he already knew him and I knew him, but we worked together to work with hand signals. That was how I alerted him. And then he'd look at me and I'd give him hand signals of where I wanted him to go. Because people think it's also noisy out in the field, which it is when people start shooting their weapons. But otherwise, you try to be quiet. You're not trying to give your position away. And when we were walking point, it was very quiet. So we did all hand signals and stuff. But the training was actually out in the field also. We would go out once a week with the dogs that were not out in the field at the time. And we had a spot a few miles outside of LZ English that was sort of like out in the field. It had brush, had some trees. It wasn't dense jungle, but we would hide somebody or something out there and then have the handler and the dog walk toward it and hope to find it.
After Prince was trained, what was the next step like?
Somebody called for a unit and we went out, but I had to go the first time with another dog handler, a senior dog handler that went with me because they had been out in the field. I never had been. And but it all fell into place because, like I said, Prince had already been there. Prince knew what to do. He was teaching me really. And so we went out and the first time went very well, and subsequent ones, he and I went out, just the two of us.
What were his jobs when he was out there? What did he do for you or for the unit?
Prince was like all the other scout dogs. They were trained, but also had the natural ability to smell things, see things, and hear things much better than a human being. And he was trained to find weapons, enemy personnel, booby traps, tunnels, tripwires, things like that. And he wouldn't turn around and bark at me. He would sit in facing the way of what he found. And then I had to kind of interpret what was going on, especially with the wind, if it was a scent. And then I would pull back with Prince, and the infantry grunts would go out and find whatever it was. So my job wasn't to do away with what he found. My job was to try to interpret what he found.
Were the dogs pretty accurate?
The dogs were extremely accurate. They were so good. They could find things that nobody ever would have known were out there. Prince himself, speaking for him, he did find tripwires. And if you think about a fishing line, a monofilament fishing line stretched across a path, hooked to a grenade in a can. If you walked up on it, you wouldn't see it. He knew it was there. He would either smell the person that had put it out there, or if it was stretched tight, he could hear it. I don't think he probably could see it because that clear line you can't see. But he found those, found a lot of other things too. And so basically the scout dogs in Vietnam, it's been estimated that they saved 10,000 lives. In other words, there would be, if it wasn't for scout dogs, there'd be another 10,000 names on the wall. And my only thing is I wish that the dogs who never were allowed to come home, that their names were on there too, because they were soldiers and they died in Vietnam, and not always in action, but by the hands of the military. But still, so we need a wall for all the scout dogs.
Can you talk about what happened to scout dogs that served in the military at the end of the war?
Not just scout dogs, but sentry dogs and tracker dogs also. All the dogs that were sent by the military to Vietnam, of the 4,000 dogs, there were only like 220 that early on in the Vietnam War returned to the United States. After that, none of them did. They said it was because of diseases, but in reality, it turned out to be that they considered them excess equipment like helicopters and weapons and so forth. And there were three choices that they did with the dogs. One, they would just let them go to fend for themselves. Not a good fate. Two, they'd give them to the ARVNs, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, scout dog handlers. And thirdly, the United States veterinarians euthanized them. And in the case of Prince, our unit was deactivated in July of 1971, just a few months after I left country. And their orders were to send them to Saigon, to the main vet clinic, and be assessed for reassignment. But a few years ago, I met with our lieutenant that was over there, and he told us that all 42 of them were euthanized. So, you take a 5-year-old dog that's very active, very good at what they're doing, and all the others, and instead of letting them come back and hopefully be with their handlers like they are nowadays, they put them down or the other. So it was, at the time, right after Vietnam, it wasn't so traumatic because we didn't know that for about 30 some years. But in the last 10 years or so, for most of us dog handlers, it's been very traumatic and has really increased our PTSD problems.
Can you talk a little bit about the shift in terms of how we treat dogs who serve now? You mentioned it in that last piece, but just, most of them come home now, correct?
That's correct. They come home and they mostly go to Lackland Air Force Base to be debriefed or whatever you call it before they can be adopted out. And then they are allowed to be adopted out with their handlers being the first one to have choice. And after that, it would be to the public. That's, of course, if the dog is the type of dog that can be with a family. Some of the sentry dogs maybe couldn't do that. But because of dog handlers, of the 10,000 dog handlers, I don't know how many, but there were many of us that did things after about 30 some years when we found out in 1999 what actually was happening to the dogs. We gathered together in groups and so forth. And finally, it ended up that a proposition or whatever it's called was signed by President Clinton at the time, allowing dogs to come back. So prior to 1999 or 2000, whatever the year was, none of the dogs were able to come back, even from other places. So the Vietnam veterans feel good that Vietnam dog handlers feel good that what we did will make a difference for the future, for the dogs and the handlers in the future.
Absolutely. And would you have taken Prince if he could have come home with you?
In a heartbeat, absolutely. I know he wouldn't have been with me now. I mean, he's here, he's in my mind now, in my heart, but he would have. You know, Prince, of course, in my mind, was the best scout dog, but they were all good, and they deserved to come home. That they didn't get that chance. So, you know, we dog handlers, many of us have emotionally paid that price. And I know that all Vietnam veterans have paid some emotional price. We just had one more issue to deal with.
Is there a specific day or specific memory that you have of Prince that really stays clear in your mind?
I do, and it has nothing to do with warfare, basically. We were out in the field, and we had set up for the night, and of course, we didn't, you know, they give these pictures of people having tents and so forth. I had a poncho. That's what Prince and I had, was a poncho. And we were all set for the night, and at night I would hook my leash that I had to my rucksack and to Prince so that he would have about a 5-foot radius, but not being able to go where he wander. Not that he would, but just in case. And when I would first get to a unit, I would let Prince smell everyone there. And I always told them that at night, Prince is very protective of me. You know, so here's this wonderful, laughing, happy, wag his tail dog, but at night he was going to protect me. And during one night, the medic in the unit walked within the distance of that leash, and Prince bit him in the rear end. And so it just shows that one of the reasons why we're so close with these dogs is that not only when they were working, but just when they were resting, they were protecting us also.
I know that Prince influenced your life when you came home from Vietnam. Can you talk about what it was like for you coming home?
Just before coming home, you know, I turned Prince over to another handler, and I was still at the 39th for about 2 weeks, but I could not see Prince. I could not talk loud enough so he would hear me because he was trying to get used to a new handler. But tell you the truth, at that time, that wasn't what was bothering me or anything, because I was going home. I was excited. I was getting out of Vietnam. So, you know, at that time, leaving a dog there was, unfortunately at the time, it was secondary in my mind. My first thing was, I get to go back to the real world. And I did that. And for all those years afterwards, until 1999, when the movie or whatever it was called, War Dogs, came out, a documentary. Most of us handlers didn't talk. We didn't get together, handlers. We didn't talk about our dogs. It was just something in the past, but it was kind of subdued. And then when it came out, that's when we realized what we had done, the guilt of leaving the dogs behind, and the sadness of leaving them behind. And that's when most of us dog handlers, now we were really upset, not only emotionally, but we were mad because at what we found out they had done to the dogs. So coming back to the world was, I think for most Vietnam soldiers at the time, was an exciting time. You know, we had little calendars that knocked down the days until the day you leave, and that type of thing. But after all those years, so 1971 to 1999 for me, it took all those years, 38, I guess that is, for me to realize that I had left Prince behind, and I should have been more vocal about it.
That was Terry Kehoe, interviewed by VVMF's Director of Education, Callie Wright. More after the break. Here at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, we wish everybody could come and visit the wall in Washington, D.C., but we know that isn't practical for a lot of people. And that's why we created the Wall That Heals. It's an exact replica of the wall at 3/4 scale, and it travels to communities all across America. The Wall That Heals and the Mobile Education Center that travels with it will be in Rice, Minnesota, August 19 through 22, and Marysville, Kansas, August 26 through 29. For more 2021 tour dates and locations, visit vvmf.org. We hope you're enjoying this episode dedicated to the use of military dogs in the Vietnam War. If you're interested in learning more about this topic or others such as the draft, helicopters, the Tet Offensive, and more, check out our topics page at vvmf.org/topics. And if you are enjoying this podcast, you probably have a friend or a family member who would enjoy it as well. Why not share it with them? Or another thing that helps us out a great deal is if you leave us a rating or a review wherever you get your podcasts, like Apple Podcasts or Spotify, for example. That tiny gesture has a huge impact in terms of helping new listeners find us. In the meantime, you can always let us know what you think by emailing echoes@vvmf.org. When most people think about military dogs, they usually think of the German Shepherd dog. And indeed, the vast majority of the dogs used by American troops in Vietnam were German Shepherds. But they weren't the only breed that saved American lives in that conflict, a fact that my next guest is very quick to point out. John Dupla, a former Army tracker, is both vocal and active in the Vietnam Dog Handlers Association. And the essential role played by Labrador retrievers in Vietnam will not be overlooked, not on John's watch. I asked John to talk about the path that led him to become a paratrooper and eventually a dog handler in the U.S. Army's very first tracker program.
I was born in Galveston, Texas. Galveston is an island, and my father had just gotten out of the service in World War II and married my mom in Galveston. We moved to a little town across the causeway to Lamar. But as I was growing up in this community, I was exposed to a lot of World War II veterans, including my father, who served in the Philippines. I took skydiving lessons from a gentleman that jumped in the Army with the 101st. A young couple moved in across the street who just got out of the military, and I would hang out with him. And he was one of the first Green Berets. He was telling me all about the military. He was teaching me judo and all this. I thought it was pretty neat. He told me that if you ever go into the service, try to find the smallest group to get involved in, because the military does everything by the numbers. And the smaller the group, the better chances of surviving, because they look after each other better. After high school, I was looking around for a job. Nobody was hiring. So military is where I went. And I volunteered for the Army to become a paratrooper, like this gentleman told me about. I actually volunteered to become an infantryman. A paratrooper. So you go into the infantry, and everybody was trying to get out anything but the infantry. But that's where I volunteered to go into, and that's where I wound up.
So when you joined the Army, you said you volunteered for the infantry. What year was that, John?
1966. I graduated from high school in 1966, and there were some of us that became skydivers, and that's how I met the man who jumped in the Army. He had the skydiving club, and come Thanksgiving, around that time, I was looking around. I still didn't have a job, and college wasn't working for me, so that's all four of us joined the Army.
Mm-hmm. And you joined with the intention of becoming a paratrooper, and
right.
Yet you ended up being a dog handler. So how did that
happen? I
happen?
became a paratrooper too.
Oh, you did?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, what happened was that I went in through training, the basic training, and then what we call AIT. Uh, then I went through jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia. From there, they gave us orders to go to Vietnam, and by that time I was infantryman with a paratrooper qualified. But when I got to Vietnam, while we were standing there at what they call the 90th Replacement Battalion in Long Binh, they had a couple of sergeants come through asking for volunteers for this program that the Army was starting up that involved a highly motivated, volunteer-only program that the Army was developing. Thinking back, what that gentleman that I grew up with told me about looking for a small group to join. With that in mind, I volunteered for this program. Did not know what it was. We were told that we were going to go to Malaysia and go to what they call the British Jungle Warfare School in Malaysia. We just called it BJWS. Once we got there, we went in civilian clothes. We had orders not to talk about this to anybody. We had to go into Saigon and get passports made, and we flew in civilian clothes to Malaysia, to this British camp, where we were issued American jungle fatigues, but no insignias, no name tags, no insignias, no rank, or anything like that. We went through the jungles of Malaysia for 2 months, 8 weeks of special jungle training. And that is when they came out and said, here's what the program's going to be at. We're going to take a bunch of American soldiers and develop tracker teams, combat tracker teams. The tracker teams are going to go to each infantry division or brigade in Vietnam. And each tracker team will have what they call a visual tracker, a cover man, a team leader, a dog handler, and a dog. We were divided into 2 groups. One was the visual tracker program, and one was a dog handler program. All the dogs were Labrador retrievers. The Americans did not have any Labrador retrievers, so they bought the dogs off the British, the Royal Veterinarian Corps, and all the dogs that were there were already in Malaysia, and some of them had already been in combat through the New Zealand and British, what they call the Malaysian uprising prior to Vietnam. And that's how they came up with this program. And our military was contacted, said, well, hey, this would probably be good for our American soldiers to learn these tactics and take it back to Vietnam and use it for our purposes, because our military did not have anything like that. And at BJWS, we got acquainted with the dogs, the Labrador retrievers. I started off as a visual tracker training program. I wasn't started off as a dog handler, but once we were assigned a team, then the Labrador retrievers was assigned to us to train with. So as part of the team, we would know about how to handle the dog. And after our training is when we got our orders to go back to Vietnam.
Can you just mention where in Vietnam you were?
Okay, well, in my case, I wound up going back as a replacement to the 1st Cavalry Division. And in Vietnam, that was at that time, they were operating in the Central Highlands, what we call 2 Corps.
Yeah. So what are some of the earliest memories you have of being on the job?
Well, it was interesting in the fact that I had to learn these new personnel that I had to work with, and that's when I learned about the 4 dogs that the 1st Cavalry Division had. There was Bruce, Shadow, Lucky, and Sambo. My job was to follow Lucky and Bruce. So we divided in two teams, Team 7 and Team 8. So I was on Team 7. So when Team 7 went out, the team had two dogs. It was Bruce and Lucky. The other Team 8 had Sambo and Shadow, but sometimes we would co-mingle.
And all 4 dogs were labs?
Every one of them were labs. Every dog, every tracker dog in Vietnam were labs. There was one attempt to train German Shepherds, and they used a scout dog, and they tried to develop him. The dog's name was Blaze. He washed out, didn't work. So in Vietnam, the only tracker dogs were Labrador Retrievers.
And what do you think it is about that breed that makes them better trackers than, say, a German Shepherd dog?
Well, that's an interesting question, because while we were training, we were exposed to the labs, and they're very competent dogs. And that was brought up because in Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken, had around 5,000 German Shepherds and only 45 Labrador Retrievers. But the labs, we were told that they were better for tracking purpose because, one, what do you use Labradors mostly for? It's like duck hunting, bird hunting. So they were already trained and bred to be silent and be around gunfire. And they had to develop a sense to retrieve their game by ground scent. So they became very good ground scent dogs. And they went after a specific target. They didn't bark. A lot of people ask us, did we cut their vocal cords? I said, no. The labs were silent. They were sturdy. They followed ground scent, because when you try it, the scent does not necessarily stay like if you're walking on a pathway. The wind changes. The path may be several feet off the track because that's where the scent is. German Shepherds were trained for walking along with sheep. They would go along until they alerted on some kind of danger that they perceived at the time. So that's why they made excellent scout dogs. They were better suited for what we call air scent. However, some of the things that came up was that the infantry guy said, well, here's a scarf, or here's a body part, or somebody of a dead soldier, or whatever. And we said, we don't use that. I see this in the movies. Here, give them a hat or something for the dog to stiff out and follow here. That wasn't practical for us. One, the enemy found out that once they found out they were being followed, they would drop 1 or 2 people off and do a diversionary tactic. They would try to get the dog, and they would leave scents for the dog. Okay. Well, the visual tracker and a team leader, and basically it was a group of 2, we looked at it and found out that, hey, look, this trail needs either a dog or a visual tracker. Okay, the visual tracker was the one to determine like the age of a track, how long ago it was, how many. The dog couldn't tell us that, so we needed the visual tracker. And we would follow that to make sure that's the one we wanted to go after. Then the team leader would signal, and sometimes it was a touch to the nose or something like this to bring the dog up. The dog was then put into a harness. Once the dog was put into a harness, that's when the dog was basically told, go to work. Almost all the tracker teams from the beginning to the end all developed wearing soft caps. We never wore a helmet. We had basically adopted South Vietnamese, like a cowboy hat that was turned up on one side. The British used that, the one hat turned up. We always laughed at them, and then they told us that head and the shoulders is a distinctive silhouette in the jungle. There's nothing round it in the jungle. Shadow became very aggressive, and after I left, he had a new handler, and they got into a skirmish, and he broke away from his handler and was killed. He was KIA'd by the enemy because he actually broke away and attacked the enemy and was killed. His handler was severely wounded too, but that's the case where the dog changed from being a docile to an aggressive dog. Bruce, on the other hand, became somewhat neurotic, and today they recognize PTSD in dogs. Bruce had that distinction because after a while, well, later in the tour, he got more and more reluctant to go out. And when he went out on a mission, his alert, everybody knew what his alert was because he stopped and went behind the handler and sat down behind the handler. He didn't go any further. You couldn't pull him.
Approximately 4,000 military working dogs served in more than 90,000 missions during the Vietnam War. Of those, only around 200 made it home to retire in peacetime.
98%, 99% of the dogs that served in Vietnam never came out of Vietnam. And that's the sad part about the legacy of them. They provided so much for us today, but nothing we can do for them but remember them and what their contributions are. And I thank this program for bringing this out, because if it wasn't for this, nobody would know that what they did in the beginning. We were the catalyst to where we see military dogs today.
In 2000, Congress passed Robbie's Law. For the first time, military working dogs had the chance to live out their lives in loving care at the end of their service.
Prior to that, the military would not allow any military dogs to be adopted, but it's gotten a lot better now. The fact that we do have military dogs being adopted today is great.
Well, and it's due largely, I think Robbie's Law was pushed through by Vietnam War dog handlers.
Yeah.
It was your generation again. You're very active in the Vietnam Dog Handlers Association, is that right?
Yes, I've been there since the very beginning. That's how I know a little bit about the Army, the Navy, and the Marines. It's not just the tractor dogs. I'm part of the organization. I'm always for the lab, and they're all German Shepherds. They have a national monument in Lackland Air Force Base, and I had some input into that because they were all going to make a National War Dog memorial with a German Shepherd. And I said, not no, but hell no. And today they have 4 dogs on there. They have the Doberman Pinscher, the Belgian Malinois, the German Shepherd, and the Labrador Retriever.
Thanks for checking out the official podcast from the founders of The Wall in Washington, D.C. We publish a new episode every 2 weeks, so be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Big thanks to John Dupla and Terry Kehoe for sharing their stories, and to Callie Wright and Elaine Kuntz for their heavy lifting on this episode. We'll see you in 2 weeks.